Hi guys, welcome to this video tutorial. So far we have created our application user class, our application DB context that will help us to communicate with the database, and our application user manager class that will help us to manage our application users within our application. Now let's add the required controllers and methods to manage user accounts in our application's identity system. We are going to create a BaseApi controller class. All other controller classes will inherit from this BaseApi controller class. This BaseApi controller class will have three basic methods that we are going to use in other controller classes for our web API. So to create this BaseApi controller, right click on your controllers folder, click add and then click controller. Select the web API to controller empty, click add and name this controller as BaseApi controller. Now click add. In this base API controller, as you see, it's inheriting from our API controller class, which means this base API controller class has access to all methods and properties of API controller class. First, let's create a property of type application user manager and assign it a value of null. This property is going to stay private, so it can be accessed only within this class. It's a type application user manager. We would need to reference, and then we would name this property as scope app user manager, and I'm going to assign it a value of null. Now I'm going to create a protected method that's going to return me an instance of application user manager. The reason why I'm using protected is because I want this method to be accessed only by classes that derive from the base API controller class. So protected method that's going to return me an instance of application user manager. I'll name this instance as app user manager, and I am going to return an instance of, so within this method I'm going to get and return an instance of my application user manager. This instance of application user manager is already created within our startup class. When the startup class runs, it will call the configuration method, and within the configuration method we have already assigned a method that is going to create an instance of our application user manager. All we are doing here in the base API controller is we are going to get that instance of our application user manager. So we are going to return, first of all, the instance. We're going to return the instance of our application manager. So we are going to request this instance from our oven context. So using the get oven context, and then we are going to get the user manager. Within the oven context, we want to get the user manager, and we have to specify the class as the application user manager class. Now we have to provide the missing reference to our oven context, that is identity oven. Now if the request returns null, it's going to throw an error. To avoid that, we are going to use a call-sing operator over here. The call-sing operator is nothing but two question marks, and any value, if the value to the left of the operand is not null, then it is going to return the value on the left. If the value of the operand to the left is null, then it's going to return the value to the right. So we are going to assign the property or the variable that we created of type application user manager and assign it a value of null. So we are going to assign that to the left of the operand. And that's it for our application user manager method. Next, we need to create a method that's going to help us to control and manage the response of our web API that is returned to the client. And before we create that method, we need to create a class that is going to help us manage the response of our model. So let's go and create the class first. So right click on your models folder and create a class, and now name this class as models manager and click add. Within this models manager class, I am going to create a private property of type application user manager. I'll provide the missing reference and name this as underscore app user manager. Now I'm going to create a method that is the constructor for my models manager class. The constructor of my models manager class is going to take the parameter of app application user manager type. And I am going to name that parameter as app user manager. I am going to assign the created property application user manager the value of my application user manager instance that I passed in my parameter. That's it for my constructor. So as soon as the constructor of my class model manager is called, it's going to assign the value of app user manager to my variable or my property here called as underscore app user manager. Now I am also going to create another class, and this class will basically hold all the properties of my users. So when the web API will return the data of my users like their first name, their last name, their username, I want that specific information to be displayed in a certain manner. And I am going to use this specific class to manage all those properties that are returned by my web API in the response to my client. I am going to name this as model return. I'm going to name this class as model return, and within this model return I'm going to have all my properties. I have added the following properties under my model return class. I have added an ID, username, first name, last name, email, email confirmed, user level, and date joined. I will use these properties to handle the response that I receive from my web APIs and assign the values to these properties and then display it to my client. Next thing I need to do is create method that is going to return these properties. So let's write a method that is going to return these properties to me. So I'll call this methods create, and what this method is going to do is it basically going to assign these values to the values that are returned by my web API. So my web API is going to return an application user. So that user's properties, I will assign it to my properties within this model return class. And then I'm going to display it to my client. Rather than directly displaying the properties that I received from my web API, I will first assign it to my model return properties and then display it to my client. So I have assigned the properties that I received from my web API response to the properties of my model return class. Now that's it for our model return create method. Now let's go back to our base API controller and create another method that will get me the instance of my model manager. Like the previous method, this method also is going to remain protected, which means that any class that is going to derive from my base API controller class will only have access to this method. So protected, and I'm going to call, it's going to return an instance of my model manager. So I am going to call the model manager type, and then I am going to name this method as model factory, and it's going to get me the instance of my models manager and return it to me. But before it gets me the instance of my model manager, I need to set some condition. The condition will check if the models manager instance is null. So let's say we were searching for a user with an ID of 100, and then the web API response returns with null, which means there's no user with the value of 100. So that means if it returns nulls, we don't have any properties that we are going to assign it to our model properties. So it's trying to assign ID to something that is null because there was nothing returned in our web API response. And then it's going to throw an error. For that, we need to mention over here that how we are going to handle that error. So I'll create a property over here, a private variable of type models manager, and let's first of all give the reference uh, models manager, and I'm going to put an underscore and name it as models manager, and let's say if models manager is equal to null. So if our models manager is equal to null, then our underscore models manager is equal to, if it's null, then create a new models manager instance. And when we create a new models manager instance, we need to specify an application user manager within our parameters that is going to help us create this models manager. So for that, in our models managers instance, I am going to pass this dot app user manager, and then I am going to return my models manage my models manager. So all I'm doing here is we are saying if the models manager variable, if its value is null, then create a new instance of models manager and assign it the value of this app user manager as the parameter and return the models manager. So if it is null, it's going to create a new instance and then return it. And if it's not null, then it's going to return the models manager. Now we will create our third method, which is also going to be protected and can only be accessed by classes that derive from my base API controller class. And this method is going to handle all the errors that we get from HTTP. So since we are going to handle errors that we get from HTTP, it will be of type
HTTP action result, and I'm going to name this method as get error result. And within these parameters of my get error result method, I'm going to specify an object of type identity result. I'm going to specify my missing reference and then going to name this variable as result. Now I am going to write my code within this method, and I'm going to start with a condition. I will say if this result is returned as null. So when we try to, let's say, get a user and the user doesn't exist, we will get a result as null. So return, if it is null, then we are going to say return as internal server error. Now we will check if the result was not succeeding. So that means we did not get 200 OK as our HTTP response, and it was not a success. So in that case, we will check if it was not a success, check if there were any errors in our result. So we will check if result dot errors, if there were any errors. So we'll see if our errors were not null, which means that there were errors. And then if there were errors, we are going to run a for each loop, and when we run the for each loop, we are going to say for every string error in the result dot errors, that's basically a collection now of all errors, and then we are going to display the error. So we will say model state dot add model error, and we need to specify a key at the exception, and the second overload is the key and the error message. So that's the overload method that I'm going to use here. So for the key, I don't want to specify any key, so I'll leave it as an empty string, and then for the message, I want to display the error as the message. Now, so if the result was not succeeded, check for if there were any errors, and if there were any errors, then loop through each error and display it. If there were no errors, then check if the model state was valid. So there's a method called as isValid. We will call that method, and we will check if the model state was valid, if it was valid. And then we return, if it was valid, then we'll return an empty bad request because it was valid, but something went wrong, but we don't know. So just an empty bad request. Finally, if the model state was not valid and there were no errors, then we are going to return bad request, and we are going to also supply the model state as the parameter. And finally, if there was nothing, so we are going to return null. No errors at all. Everything was working fine, so we return null. So that's it for our get error result method. And now in the next video tutorial, we will create our accounts controller, and all the required methods for our web API. So thank you for watching.